Thank you so much, Anna, and thank you for giving me, entrusting with me the honor of taking 9 workshops, 27 or 30 so presentations, and overnight distill them into something useful for you here. But I'm helped by Esther here. She's visualizing everything, and so but it's I guess will also be a very authoritarian session because I will talk to you and dictate what I and the chair saw and heard yesterday. But I'll do my best. I think I want to start with, so we have 3 areas here. We have parties and institutions in the middle, civic education, and public space, sort of the 3 big areas from yesterday. I want to start with parties and institutions. There was a lot here, unsurprisingly, with so many political scientists around. But I think the first sort of focusing on knowledge here. So for each area we have knowledge, we have gaps, and we have actions. Focusing on knowledge here. So first, there seems to be a great consensus that it's real, right? Regardless of which measures you use, there are real changes in Europe. Democracy is eroding in a number of countries, and these measures reflect real, actual changes. Judges are being attacked, journalists are being attacked, and I also point out academics, not the least, being attacked and silenced. Civil society, of course. Freedom of expression, generally, is most attacked and also often happens first. And secondly, that illiberal actors, I'm using Anna's terminology here. There's discussion about the terminology. I'm loyal to, of course, my deputy director. The illiberal actors have already changed norms and values in many countries. And that's just a fact. Another fact is that if we look at this sort of both historically and outside of Europe as well as inside Europe, once erosion starts and gets going, it rarely stops. There are very few cases where erosion has been turned around. We have, in recent times, a few of them, Ecuador, South Korea, and so on, outside of Europe, but they tend to be the exception, and that's a warning I think we need to keep in mind. When things are turned around, when erosion is stopped or reversed, it seems to be surprisingly rare that it's actually the formal institutions, formal checks and balances that is responsible for it. Surprisingly often, it's more informal norms, informal institutions that is doing the job. Constitutional courts and the judiciary, in a traditional sense, rarely play a part, and so on. But rather, sort of, there are occasions of parties, intra-party elites, turning on leaders who are eroding democracy and unseating them, getting rid of them, or it's often a him, right? It's an informal accountability mechanism within parties or in cross-party alliances that stop erosion. And the only sort of more formal institution that seems to be important here are elections. So they come in with elections, but it's also elections that have been sort of a tool for getting rid of them. So I think we need to pay attention to that. But within the sort of rise of illiberal actors, parties, we haven't paid attention enough to the role of emotions and the use of language in the rise of these illiberal parties. So not only do we have an academic discussion to have about whether it's illiberal actors or we should talk about populist or nationalist and so on, all these different terms. But in the rise of these actors and their success or failure, we need to do more work, research on the role of emotions, emotional appeals, emotional responses, and our human nature, working perhaps with social psychologists and evolutionary biologists and those sorts of people who know more about that than we do as political scientists. And also the use of language, of course. Another part where we don't have enough knowledge is the role of leadership and leaders, individual leaders, the things that we can throw in regressions, right? They're always in the error term, as we say. And of course, we need to do more work on this, the role of informal accountability institutions, not the formal vertical or horizontal or diagonal civil society and so on, but accountability mechanisms within institutions that are informal. Now, a big gap is on countermeasures. There seems to be many suggestions for actions, strengthen checks and balances, unmask illiberals without polarizing, without getting into the vicious trap of even more sort of feeding polarization, that we should critique policy and behavior, not the persons, protect media, protect academics that are under threat in so many places, the judiciary, of course, civil society, recognize the real grievances of those who support illiberal actors, and a sort of long washing list of things that have been suggested when it comes to parties and institutions. But it's very unclear what empirical evidence we have for what actually works. I think this is partly natural because it's a relatively recent phenomenon. It takes time to evaluate. I think we can also look more to historical cases and learn from that. So let me move over to public space. No, that's over here. Yes. Here's the space for public space. What do we know? Well, there's sort of two areas. One that has to do more with the media and one that has to do with polarization in the public space. And let me start with the latter. It's very clear that polarization fuels the rise of illiberalism. We know that. We also know that there's been an expansion in expression of this polarization, also in the streets, marches, demonstrations, public expressions and gatherings and protests. But sort of non-illiberal protests, march, demonstrations, that is sort of left, liberal, green, they still dominate. There's still more in a number of events and also a number of people who participate. So it's an important maybe corrective to what we have a perception of sometimes. But illiberal expressions are on the rise. There's a kind of a problem here that, so we also know that the polarized on both sides are most vocal and are the ones we hear. Whereas in many societies that represents maybe, even if you include sort of the supporters, maybe a third of society. And there's often a large, and then you have sort of the non-polarized but sort of stable political supporters of different sort of moderate, normal, mainstream, whatever you want to call it, parties. And then often there's a silent third that is not heard. We don't know what the preferences are. And maybe that 1/3 is also the important 1/3 to move in defense of democracy, rather than the ones that are already polarized. But we don't really know what drives different groups, their attraction to illiberalism. So we know illiberal actors attract supporters from many different groups, and we know maybe something about what attracts, makes sort of general attraction, but there may be a lot of group differentiation when you attract from different types of groups that we know very little about. And here again, that attraction, the role of emotions and the role of use of language is something we need to look much more into in terms of expanding research. And that's sort of the immaterial part. But we also, it also seems clear from yesterday's workshops that we know very little about, or at least far too little about, potential real material foundations that make illiberal rhetoric and illiberal actors more attractive. There are lots of discussions about the role of inequality, role of financial crisis, terrorism, immigration. We can have other issues added to that list, but very little in terms of solid research that can tell us the actual role of material conditions in the rise of illiberalism and illiberal actors. But it seems clear that people in our societies in Europe now, I mean, there are many groups that have real actual grievances that at least we see could be potentially a driving force or something illiberal actors can use to rise to power. Again, there are suggestions for action in this public space, that to make a civilized debate a goal in itself. And in this, again, public space, sort of the public debate should, when we engage illiberal actors, must focus on their policies and actual behavior and not critique person. Because critiques of person would then just feed polarization. And there's been discussion in several, at least two, maybe three, I think, workshops that I heard or read or heard from the chairs about, that thinks that question mark, do we need a new social contract, broadly speaking? It's been expressed in slightly different ways in relation to inequality, in relation to societies being de facto polarized. So it's one thing that the debate becomes polarized and maybe some part of the public space, and you have parties that diverge from each other. But there seems to be the undeniable fact as well that also our societies de facto become sort of polarized in the sense of people have very different living conditions and increasingly greater variation in living conditions. Greater inequality is a fact, and that translates also into areas of education and healthcare and childcare and where you live and what your life chances are. So again, that sort of ties into the discussion about how much is this about emotions and language and immaterial things, fears, and so on, and how much is actually material conditions. And then we have the third space, area, civic education. What do we know? Well, we know, it seems, that civic education can work for enhancing knowledge, political knowledge, if you like, focusing particularly here on knowing political leaders and their party programs and things like that. So civic education and how public processes work, or political processes work, and so on. But it's very unclear to the extent to which that increasing knowledge translates into changing attitudes and behavior. There's some research suggests that enhancing knowledge, so getting a higher political knowledge, sort of reduces or acts as a bulwark against increasing illiberal attitudes or authoritarian attitudes, so protect democratic attitudes. But it's very clear to what extent that, unclear whether that translates into action. For example, no evidence suggests that the increasing political knowledge would sort of reduce probability of that individual voting for one of these illiberal actors. And so this, I think, is an important sort of point also to a gap or an important research discussion to have, sort of coming back to what the economists used to say, I don't care what you say you do, I care what you do. Right? So the extent to which was sort of when we measure attitudes, actually has much of bearing on how people act out there when they are not answering a survey. But it's an important finding in itself, I think, with the knowledge. But there are additional gaps here, sort of as a tension between enhancing political knowledge in sort of a neutral way, and when that becomes propaganda for democracy or a particular form of democracy or particular, and you can lose credibility. And also how you target civic education. Typically it's self-selection into civic education, for adults at least. And then you risk preaching to the choir. And I think Matt's demonstration of how we all were all united yesterday morning was sort of an illustration to that. We talk to each other here, and when you get civic education, we get people like ourselves in the room. Whereas maybe, again, the silent third, or maybe even some of the moderately radicalized are more important to reach, and not sure, and we don't really know how to do that. And there's also need for more research on what I at least would like to think of as the problem of, or how humans tend to deal with cognitive dissonance. So we don't like to have views and attitudes that we don't feel hang together, right? And some research suggests that individuals tend to, if they agree with a policy proposal or a decision proposal, even though it's undemocratic, if people sort of feel it's right, then they will sort of change their view of democracy and say, oh, but this is a democratic proposal, right? And change what they perceive to be democratic in order for it to sort of fit with what they want to be done. And that can be a problem for, I think, both for democracy in general, but also for this idea of, or at least has to be acknowledged in this civic education and maybe in the public space as well, that if we want to communicate with people who have been radicalized, I think there was some discussion about that yesterday too, it's not only about, okay, we have to tell them how good democracy is and how things are. We have to understand how they perceive democracy and the proposals that we think of as undemocratic, but they don't. And it doesn't help to say, well, you're undemocratic, because that's not creating an opening. So, in the civic education, the actions are pretty straightforward. More civic education and better civic education. Very straightforward. So, if I just take 2 more minutes and offer some sort of meta-reflections on this. As scientists, we are, and I think also in the policy practitioner community, these days there is a lot of emphasis on finding out the facts. how things are. And then if we can explain that, so that the explanation then can be help for action. And I think that's good. But we also have to recognize that in this area, things like emotions, emotional appeals, emotional reactions to different types of language, different types of ideas, play probably a very important role. And it's really hard to study with sort of our approaches to facts. Put numbers on, running regressions. And that sort of the narrative of the illiberal actors and the responses to narratives, the creation of fear and hope, and the creation of aversion. Boom. These are really, really probably important mechanisms in what everything's going on here. And we need to have better tools and think about how we can do research on that and be useful for the policy practitioner community in terms of providing better evidence that's not necessarily based on facts. There's this whole tension that relates to the facts between sort of education, which you think of as sort of neutral conveyance of factual and other information and tools for critical reasoning and other things, and sort of more propaganda. And there have been discussions about, well, propaganda just to sort of communicate a little more sort of intentive communication, right? Trying to convince or trying to convey, trying to defend democracy. And the extent to which education is not enough, but maybe some more propagandistic approaches may be called for in an area of vast disinformation being spread in social media and beyond. But I think we have to take really seriously in all these three areas, really, really seriously, the heterogeneity of potential sort of listeners. Listeners to research, listeners to sort of those of you who are more from more civil society type organizations or international organizations or political parties. At least the three groups of the already polarized, for and against. Like in Venezuela, you're for or against Chavez, right? There's nothing in between, or was. But that sort of thing. And the sort of more stable, if you like, engaged and stable and moderate people, and the detached, disillusioned, silent, maybe 1/3. It's when we communicate, I'm not sure the communication is the same to all these three types of, at least three, whether it's sort of within the parties and institutions or in civic education or in the general public space. And finally, I want to, okay, so not 2 minutes, but 4. But finally, I want to point to some things that we have not discussed, or at least in terms of reaching who, in terms of actors, that we have not discussed that I think we also need to do more research and have more knowledge about. How to reach, say, leaders of political parties, strategies of political parties, and leaders of organizations that are active of the mainstream parties and so on. Because most of the things that sort of come out here and that were suggested are things they have to approve or implement or initiate or budget for, right? So how is whatever knowledge we have going to be communicated to them. And the other part, the polarizing elites, whether they are left, they are right extremists or religious extremists or whatever extremists there are that are fueling illiberal values and ideas, are we sure that communicating with them is a waste of time? Because I don't think we often think of us as engaging with them and the fear of maybe legitimizing them or whatever. But do we know that that's useless? I'm not sure about that. We have not talked about the business, the funders of illiberal actors, whether they are domestic businesses, international collaborators, Putin and his oligarchs that are active all across Europe, and so on. Follow the money was something that some people used to say. And we have not talked very much about foreign influences and foreign leaders. Russia, China, Turkey, Iran, Saudi Arabia, so on, that are sponsoring and fueling illiberal actors. So on that note, I think we just leave it with those thoughts, summary and thoughts of yesterday's session. Thank you.